Welcome everybody to the last Australia at Home session for the year. We're all glad to see you zooming in from across the country. My name is Weatherill. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Thrive by Five, an initiative within the Minderoo Foundation, a philanthropic foundation based in Perth, but with a national and a global mission. And I'm coming to you today from Ghana country, South Australia, my old stomping ground. So back in South Australia for Christmas to see family and friends. Welcome everybody, and it's great to see you all. Now we're recording this session to be uploaded online later, so please be respectful and not say anything that you wouldn't otherwise say in a public forum. We encourage you to keep your video on. We found that really does add to the sense of being together that Zoom meetings of this sort facilitate. So if you're on a computer or a laptop, you can set your screen to gallery view by clicking the button at the top of the right-hand side, and that gets you to see all the other lovely faces that are online here at the moment. There also is a chat function, so please use this to ask questions or to make a comment. So everybody is muted, except me, of course, and we'll unmute you if you're called on during the Q&A a little bit later on. Would encourage people to use their full names, and if you are representing an organisation, if you could include that in your name when you ask your question. Afsa, I think, just put something in chat. She's helping us out with admin and tech support. So if there's something going wrong for you at your end, don't hesitate to get in touch with her, and she'll see whether she can sort it out for you. So the first thing I want to do is just talk a little about the Thrive by Five campaign, which we kicked off on the 1st of September this year. It really kicked off with an open letter to the federal government calling for a new early learning system for our country. And our campaign goal is about universal high quality early learning for every child in this country. And the reason why we're pursuing a campaign of this sort is because of the profound question of the development of children in the first 5 years of life. We know that the size of a child's brain reaches 90% of the adult's size of brain by the age of 5. And these early years aren't just critical for learning, they're critical for health and well-being and the trajectory, the healthy trajectory of a child throughout their life and, of course, into adulthood. However, the importance of this development and learning process, even though we've known about this now for 30 years, the old view was that there was a genetic endowment and there was some natural process of development that occurred. We now know that it's high quality interactions between parents and caregivers and high quality practitioners that make all of the difference. But we've known that for a long time, but decision makers haven't acted as though that is the case. And we have what we want to have is a system of early education and care, but in too many cases, we have a system which is regarded by policymakers as merely a system of child minding for parents who are returning to work. And while it does play that critical role, it also plays a much more profound role in the healthy development of children. So that's why we're heading up a campaign called Thrive by Five. It is about advocating for high quality, universally accessible early education and care in this country. And it's time that the value of play-based learning is recognised and that every child benefits. And it's about putting information and empowering parents, but it's also about making sure that parents are supported with high quality offerings. We know that mothers in particular who want to join the workforce are really punished by the current system. It's expensive and it's punitive for people that want to work more than just a few days a week. And I think one of the things that did emerge throughout COVID was we really were reminded about the essential nature of this service. But we don't treat these workers who really are a critical element of our education system, as though with the respect that they deserve. And we've seen that the policy responses really disrespected many of these critically important essential workers. That's why it's important to act now, we believe, to make sure that decision makers hear our voice. And we think we've got a powerful argument, and we'll hopefully develop some of those arguments throughout the course of today's panel. I want to introduce the panellists. First, Correna Haythorpe. She's Federal Secretary of the Australian Education Union, a union which represents Australian public school and early childhood and TAFE teachers and education leaders and education support staff, both industrially and professionally. So welcome, Correna. And secondly, I want to introduce Sam Page, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Early Childhood Australia, a role that she's held for really a long period now. In fact, I can remember when I was working as a minister in this area, Sam was in this role. So she's been the head of really this sector for a long period and has been a consistent and powerful advocate for early childhood, acting in the interests of young children and their families and those in the early childhood field. So welcome, Sam. So,
thanks, Jay. I must have started when I was 25.
The year in review. So we've got a panel discussion which is really about talking a bit about what's going on. So the campaign had a successful launch on the 1st of September, and the sector has been unified behind this campaign. And it's a campaign which is really about many voices, one message. And so what's the message? Well, there's a real and urgent need for change to this critical area of public policy. And we did write an open letter to the federal government asking for reform of the system. And so the areas that we really want to focus on today is perhaps I address this question first to you, Sam. The federal government's free early learning plan during COVID had some benefits. The research has shown that it made a significant difference for working families and has been good for children and women in the economy. Can you tell us about some of the positive and also some of the negative effects of that policy change?
Yes, well, I think one of the biggest positives was we did see a lot of vulnerable and disadvantaged children that services hadn't seen before coming into early childhood services. So that was terrific, and services have done a lot of work to try and hold on to access for those families. So to, excuse me, as the childcare subsidy got switched back on, to support them with additional childcare subsidy applications and other mechanisms for being able to continue to access. But the difficulty was that when the government switched on free childcare, it was free childcare at 50% of the funding that had the childcare subsidy that services have been receiving before, which really limited capacity. And in many areas where communities were in lockdown and families were keeping children at home, that was fine. But in some areas where they were less affected by COVID or more families were employed in essential service roles than the less than 50%, that created difficulties because services couldn't operate at their normal capacity level, and so they were having to ration who got access to services and who didn't, and that put them in a difficult spot, and it also created some confusion and frustration for families. I think the people most negatively affected by the free childcare was the staff, the people who had to implement that change with 3 days notice, people who lost hours of work because the service had to reduce its capacity and couldn't keep everyone on at the hours that they were working before that. And so it was a really tough time, I think, for many people working in the sector. But having said that, I have sympathy for the government who were in a having to make a quick decision, and it did, to their credit, keep services operating, keep services open, keep the sector viable. It's really a matter of how we rebuild now from that.
Yeah, Thanks, Sam. Correna, what sort of feedback were you getting from educators that you represent?
Yeah, thanks, Jane. Firstly, can I just acknowledge that I'm joining this meeting from Ghana land here in Adelaide and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. Look, it's been an extraordinary year in terms of our membership. We cover the preschool sector, and so we're talking to preschool directors, to teachers and to educators who work in, kindergarten and preschools. And their feedback, I think, Sam's made a really good point there about the impact on the workforce, because with decisions being made at very short notice by governments, our members have had to pivot incredibly quickly, whether that's to a situation in terms of working remotely, whether it's keeping their centres open as an essential service for those workers who were deemed to be essential, or whether it's full closures. So it's the learnings from, I think, this year around the flexibility and the incredible dedication of the workforce. I hope the public really has learnt, that we've got an incredible group of people working in early learning across Australia, a group of people who've really put their time and their expertise on the line this year in terms of a whole range of things through COVID. But also the impact of funding has been so much of an issue, because in a year where so many people have been out of work or, have faced incredible disadvantage through the sort of financial circumstances that they find themselves in, announcements from some state governments about, free preschool and reducing the overall costs of preschool for families has been very welcome news indeed.
Just while I've got you, Correna, so there's two very different experiences. We had the childcare system that fell over and the old system had to be switched off, and this new one created for a temporary period. And then we had a school system which, during the same period, essentially didn't suffer any of those difficulties. Can you talk about the contrast, the two different sort of systems, and in particular maybe a remark about the different ways in which childcare / early learning is funded compared with how schools are funded?
Yes, thanks, and apologies for the dog. It's one of the perils of working from home, having a much more needier companion than I've been used to. In terms of the preschool sector and schools, there have been, I think, some issues which are very similar in terms of the impact on the workforce. We've got our members have had to concentrate on the issues around social distancing and health and wellbeing and what, not only for themselves but for the children and students that are in their care. The significant difference for the sectors is that the preschool sector, of course, is subject to year-by-year funding, and in terms of universal access of 15 hours, and this creates deep uncertainty for not only our members, but for the parents and families who they work with. And so when you're dealing with a workforce that already has that uncertainty, with a workforce that experiences high levels of casual employment, it does add a new layer in terms of, I think, the health and wellbeing that our members, of our members this year, particularly when they're trying to respond to very rapidly changing circumstances. We had, in some instances, over the weekend, we had systems shut down and people were advised that they were very quickly moving to a remote learning situation. In other instances, we had systems switch back on over a weekend, particularly here in South Australia, my home state, where things change very quickly from a Friday to a Monday, and people were expecting to be working in terms of remote learning, but were then told over the weekend that they were all due back at work on the Monday morning. So very high levels of anxiety go along with that, I think, in terms of their own personal safety, but making sure that they can create a safe environment for the children and students that they work with. And of course, that's where funding is just so critically important. When you have secure funding, when you know what your staffing allocations are going to be, when you know what your programs look like into the future, then you can actually give people, permanency, proper and decent work going forward.
Yeah. Sam, can you just reflect on this, the difference in the funding systems between, the education system or the school-based education system and the early education and care system?
Yes, well, I mean, certainly the school system, the teachers working in the school system had that, guarantee of ongoing employment, and the pivot was really to supporting children through online and remote learning, or supporting families with younger children, whereas the educators and teachers working in the early childhood services, excuse me, that are relying on childcare subsidy, were in a much more precarious position. And it highlighted some real workforce weaknesses that we have. I think the number of staff employed on a casual basis, the number of temporary visa holders, the number of people working across multiple services, which was a particular risk in the COVID pandemic. So I think we knew we had workforce problems before 2020, but 2020 has certainly highlighted the extent to which that is a risk to the sustainability of the sector, but also in providing quality services to children and families.
Yeah. So I know that before the pandemic, the United Workers Union conducted a survey which revealed that I think about 30-odd% of early educators in the cities and about 44% of early educators in regional areas were thinking that they'll be working in a different job in the next 12 months. So what do you think that is likely to have worsened since the pandemic, and just generally, how do you reflect on that, those sort of statistics?
Yeah, look, I think that survey work was really worrying at the time, and I do think it's worsened. I was really concerned about the amount of social media discussion there was about the feelings of mistreatment, the feelings of not being valued that were coming from early childhood educators. A lot of people saying, "That's it, I'm out, I'm not working in this sector anymore." The problem is we don't have publicly available data on how many people we've lost this year from the sector, and whether they're likely to consider coming back or whether they're lost forever. I think this is a reckoning of a sort for the sector to start to say early childhood educators, teachers and service leaders need to be valued properly. They need to be treated as professionals in a respectful way if we're going to have a workforce in the future.
Correna, did you want to...
and wages is part of that. I just want to say wages is part of it, but it's not the whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Correna, do you want to just reflect on this question of respect and valuing educators, early educators?
Yeah, look, it's critically important, and unfortunately, it just doesn't seem to be a Commonwealth priority. As Sam has said, the wage and conditions issue is just so essential to ensuring that we can attract and retain professionals into the early learning sector. From our perspective, we've got for early childhood education workers, we've got it's a highly casualised workforce. It's a workforce that, at the moment, year by year, many people don't know whether they've got work going into the future. We know we've lost a number of people over this year through COVID. And I think one of the challenges for state and territory governments and for the Commonwealth is to look at a detailed analysis of the impact of this for the workforce around where we need to lift our game, to use that term, in terms of attraction and retention, where we need to look at permanent funding, where we need to look at ongoing employment for people, and of course the conditions of work. And one of our key objectives as part of our campaign is ensuring that we've got fully qualified professionals as well, that they've got the opportunity to undertake qualifications, and that they're supported throughout their employment by the employer in terms of accessing professional learning, so they can stay at the the top of their game.
Yeah, and can I just switch now to some of the things that have emerged this year? There's been a budget reply from Anthony Albanese, which put early childhood on the agenda, and also the New South Wales and the Victorian government made some initiatives. I might just get both of you to reflect on those. Anthony Albanese announced in his budget response that a cap on the childcare subsidy would be scrapped, and pledged that a Labor government would investigate a long-term plan to see families pay no more than 10% of their childcare costs, those costs of childcare. And the New South Wales government recently announced an extension of COVID relief to mobile and community preschools. And the Victorian government, I think, had that free kinder for 3 and 4 year olds and reduced fees in unfunded sessional kinder. So could you, I'll go to you first, Sam. What do you think about these developments, and is this demonstration a bit of momentum that we can build on?
I think it was good. Of course, Labor had taken much of that policy platform to the last election, but in my opinion, it wasn't well handled. It was late. It was confusing. It didn't get the positive reaction that it perhaps deserved. We were a bit concerned that they might walk away from that. It's great to see them holding on to that. And I think the pandemic really changed families' perceptions about how important early childhood education is to their life and their capacity to work, as well as the well-being of their children. And they got a taste for free access and proper funding. And so I think potentially there's a better environment for the ALP opposition to continue to put those positions forward. I think it was really unfortunate to see the way the counterattack, if you like, that this was throwing money at high-income families who don't really need it. I think we have to work really hard to say that early education should be a universal platform in the same way that school education is. And if you want to pay more to go private, you can, but actually everybody deserves access to a quality universal system. And we should be able to build that for young children. And I know it's complicated. I know there's a lot of ifs and buts about how we go about that. But I think if we can hold on to that principle, and everybody pays taxes, right? So everybody should have access to health services and education services. That's part of the fundamental fabric of Australian society. It's really just about recognising that what's happening in early childhood settings is education, right from the beginning, when children first come in, and so it should be funded accordingly. And I think families see that now, and I think one of the really good things to come out of the horrendous year that has been 2020 is the respect between families and educators and teachers in early childhood services. We can see there's been a strengthening of that relationship, a mutual respect, and families are much more on board, I think, with the importance of stability of employment and proper professional wages, and being right up there with affordable early education. So families have always want better affordability, but I think there was a time there where people were putting affordability as an opposite to quality or opposite to professional wages, whereas I think families now see increasingly that those two things are both important and have to go together.
Yeah, it's a great point, Sam. Correna?
Yeah, thanks, Jan. Thanks, Sam. I think there is a momentum that's building around this issue, and certainly COVID has put a spotlight on the importance of childcare, early learning and care. I say childcare because that was sort of how the announcement was framed, but from our perspective, it is, of course, much more than that. in terms of its importance to our society. But I am a little concerned, to be honest, that as part of this conversation, the importance of preschool, I don't think is being highlighted as it should be. The announcements that were made by the ALP were fantastic, but what was missing was the commitment around preschool, the commitment that they took into took to the last election. And if we're being really honest, their platform at the moment, which is sort of being finalised, I think actually weakens their commitment to ongoing funding for universal access in terms of 3-year-old provision, which is of key concern to us. But when looking at what the states and territories are doing in terms of their announcements, one of the other things that's very important to us is having public provision. And in New South Wales in particular, that's an issue in terms of for preschool and whatnot, in terms of who provides preschool for our children. The announcements in Victoria are incredibly welcome to our members too, and I think really provide us with some hope about what can be done if state and territory governments actually get on board with this issue. But we also need, opposition parties within those states and territories to get on board.
Great, thanks, Correna. And look, that's a great segue into our next session. So the next little session, before we come to your questions, so to make sure you send your questions into the chat, and we'll call on you for you to ask those questions. But so the next session is really the year to come up. So what's going to happen next year? So the Throw Up by 5 campaign has really been growing in momentum. We've got, a very large number of people that are meeting every Thursday to plan and to promote activities. The first part of the year is very much going to be focused on Canberra. So we're running a Voices in Canberra campaign. And the notion of that is for us to build some momentum and put this very much in front of policymakers. Of course, this is a complex system that involves both the state and the Commonwealth government. One of the advantages out of the COVID arrangements is that we do have a new structure, the National Cabinet, which really puts the Premiers and the Prime Minister face to face on a regular basis. And it is likely that we are going to see, I think, a much greater dialogue, much quicker paced reform potentially than the old COAG process, which were glacial. So that is an opportunity for us, and we want to get buy-in from both levels of government. But our first target, of course, is the May budget, and there is some low-hanging fruit that exists in that budget, and I think Corena's touched on them. The universal access for 4-year-old preschool, which is a Commonwealth state national partnership, has just been rolled over every year for the last 7 years. So there is no funding certainty. It is a simple matter for them to construct a 5-year partnership, which is typical for partnerships of this sort. And I think it would be, apart from being an important reform, I think it would also be an important, small but measurable win for the campaign if we were able to achieve something like that. So we're going to be putting that on the agenda. We'd like also to extend funding to 3-year-old preschool, and of course we'd like some response of the type that the budget reply of Federal Labor or one of the other models that are out there from either KPMG or the Grattan Institute about increasing the level of support for families. And finally, we think that some workforce initiative around training and skills is critical to make sure that we do have the early educators necessary to actually meet these needs if we do create these opportunities. So we are, by the 29th of January, we're trying to pull together a budget ask. It will be in those general areas. And we think that there are some real prospects of getting some movement, but it won't happen unless we put pressure on government. So the discussions that we want to talk about now are how do we actually move this year forward in this agenda. So And perhaps I might start with you, Correna. What do you see the role of your organisation and the workforce more generally in this campaign? What do we need to do to make a difference?
Yeah, thanks, Jay. Well, across the country, we have a very large membership. We've got 190,000 members in preschool, schools and TAFE. And I think the critical thing is that this campaign has to be everybody's issue. It cannot be one that's just siloed to people in terms of our membership who work in preschool settings, because of the critical connection between preschool and schools as part of the lifelong journey that our children have. So from our perspective, in terms of engaging people, we need to find that hook for our broader membership because they have the capacity to connect in with their communities, in communities right across Australia in terms of this issue, and have those one-on-one conversations about the importance of securing this funding in terms of universal access funding for the preschool sector. So telling those stories about how this funding can be used, how it can be used to change children's lives, the deep impact that early education, ECE has for our children and our families, and particularly for children who come from disadvantaged backgrounds or who experience the compound disadvantage of perhaps, living in poverty, or children who have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander background or whose first language is not English, about the critical importance of ensuring that those children have equal access in terms of early learning. So from our perspective, we need to make sure that governments understand the importance of this, that they understand that connection with community. And the way to do that is to gather those stories, to connect parents to this campaign. There is a bit of a challenge though, and that is that if we're talking about preschool in particular, it's a 12 to 18 month journey for most parents where their children come to preschool and then they move on in terms of school. So we've got to hook those people in and keep them with us as part of securing this campaign over, over the next couple of years. And I hope we can get some outcomes a lot quicker than that.
So Sam, what role do you think that parents, educators and professionals really have in trying to get this message across right now?
I think educators have a really important role in terms of talking to parents and engaging parents. I think parents, I take Corena's point, that families are only in preschool for a short period of time. They're in early childhood services more generally for a little bit longer, but they're still a fleeting and very busy, very distracted population. But I think for the first time we have, people of my age who dealt with high costs of long daycare back when their children were younger, and everybody who has been through that system, everybody who has experienced that, has an empathy for how stressful that is for families to navigate, and we're not having the debate anymore about whether children should or shouldn't go to early learning or early childhood services. And that in itself is a change from where the debate was, maybe 15 years ago, 10 years ago. I think we've moved on from that. So I think what we need to tap into is that broader public experience and understanding and empathy for these arguments. But I've also always thought that we need business leaders on side. I think, we've got to have changed attitudes amongst the business community and the CEOs who are concerned about children's education and success long term, as well as families' capacity to make choices about work and work engagement. And if we can tap into that concern, I think that potentially will do a lot for the campaign and for the outcomes we're trying to achieve. And trying to stop this disintegrating into multiple different arguments, like the old childcare should be tax deductible just drives me insane. In terms of can we once and for all rule that out as a policy option for serious consideration, and focus on the policy solutions that are achievable and make sense and deliver the outcomes that the outcomes for both children and parents.
Thanks, Sam. Just an observation about that point you made about even parents of children that are older now. What's been interesting, what's emerged from our research, is that the support for reforms of this sort are almost as strong amongst parents of children that are of school age as they are of children of preschool age, which is a bit consistent with what we're finding more generally. So we're finding that about 2/3 of people support these reforms across the whole of the population. And what's interesting, only about 20% of people are undecided, and about 10% opposed. But what's interesting is that it doesn't vary greatly between progressive or conservative voters, men or women, or young or old. A little bit of difference in the ways you might imagine, but nothing substantial. So I think there is a broad understanding of the value of investment in the early years, both not only just for your own child or your own personal sort of circumstances, but for society generally. So I think we're not running an argument which doesn't have a basis. There's a basis out there, and I think there's a lot of good ideas that don't always filter to the top of the political process. And I suppose that's the question: how do we actually cut through and make sure that this does actually deliver? So it might just be, obviously you've been lobbying in this area for a long time, Sam and Correna. What do you think the mindset that we have to shift in terms of current politicians? Because to be brutally honest, they're overrepresented in blokes that are slightly older blokes as well. But so the key decision makers probably don't represent the broad cross section of society. What do you think's going on in their minds about this agenda, and what are the things that we have to shift? Sam, do you want to have a crack at that first?
I think one of the most worrying things in the current rhetoric we're seeing from the government, the federal government, is that subsidised early childhood services should be targeted at disadvantaged and vulnerable children and disadvantaged and vulnerable families and communities, and that middle-class working families can take care of themselves and don't need as little government intervention as possible. And that is also, there's a hint of red tape reduction, regulatory reform in there, which I think is a little bit concerning. I'm a bit worried that they might try to throw a little bit of money at this to make the noise go away, and that we won't actually come out of that with a better system. I think we really need to hold on to the better system that we're trying to achieve and all of the parts. And Jay, you talked about it earlier. We need something in workforce. We need something around the way the services are funded and the kind of delivery models and jobs that come from that. I don't think that we have a cabinet that is very heavily dominated by the people who designed the current childcare system, current childcare subsidy system, and convincing them that it's not working is really hard, because they are seeing a rapid bounce back from COVID. They are seeing services filling up again. Their spend has been pretty much on par with what they predicted it to be. So from their perspective, it is working. We need to, I think, say to them, build on what their reasons for investing in this system and try and modify it in a way that is palatable if we're going to achieve anything in this current government. It's quite different to think about what we might be able to achieve if there's a change of government down the track. But in terms of working with this government, I think we need to keep talking about the importance of universal access and the extent to which working families are heavily reliant on the subsidies, getting the subsidies right. but more than anything, the return on investment that they get from their investment in this system, both in terms of children's educational outcomes and particularly women's workforce participation. So that was a bit convoluted, Jay, but I think you know, that's what keeps me awake at night. What would convince this current cabinet, which is dominated by people who designed the current system, to make changes that would produce something better?
Yeah, and I suppose, I mean, look, the truth is there's the quality of our arguments, and that's always been important, but there's also pressure, and that's what the campaign's about, is to try and get a list of supporters that we can then mobilise and create pressure for change. And just on that, if you haven't already, there is a campaign to join, thriveby5.org.au, and if you can register there, and that will add your name to the list of people that we communicate with, and you'll get updates about the campaign. But I might just, there are a couple of eminent Australians in the chat today, and I just wanted to bring them into the conversation before I open up generally for Q&A. We have Eva Cox with us, and we might just invite Eva just to give a few reflections, and then I might go to Doreen Blythe, who is an early educator and mentor of many early educators, and get her to make a few remarks. But Eva, if I can invite you in first, could you just give us your reflections?
Thank you. I think part of the problem with the discussion today is we haven't really clarified the difference between government funding for long day care or other services and the state-based preschool education funding. And I think they're, unfortunately, right from the very beginning, have provided difficulties of trying to blend them and do them. And I think we really do need to address the idea of the payments. And I think one of the issues we need to also look at is creating a standardized quality of care across, and fees for the care, by trying to actually set up a direct relationship between childcare services and the government, so that we can negotiate on the sorts of things you're talking about, on hours, on ratios, on training, on staffing, on various other things. I know there's standards there, but they're sort of check them out and see if they're actually abided. And at the moment, we've got this very messy system where there isn't anything which really unites all of the providers of long day care and the providers of preschool education, that you can work a universal system. I think one of the dangers is we just pick out little bits. The government will fund little bits, and then it'll become even harder to try and put it back together again. And having had a long experience in this area, I think we just need to, I mean, you've got a good heading there, Thrive Till 5. And I think we need to work out how we can put health, education, social relationships, and all of that together in a bundle and start pushing it, because otherwise I think we'll just get dribbles.
Yeah, you're right. I think that's a powerful observation, Eva. And I think it really goes to Sam's anxieties about, if we define the problem too narrowly, we'll get a narrow solution. So we have to define the problem broadly. And I think, I mean, we use the phrase early learning, but it's very hard to come up with a word that describes essentially 5 service systems. There's preschool, infant and maternal health, child protection, community and family services, and did I mention preschool or childcare? So there's 5 discrete, there's probably many more. There's a whole bunch of allied health services and disability services, which all...
How about just using early childhood services, because that really does cover the whole thing, and it doesn't divide it up into the divisions that we've got, which are often quite artificial, because the services are often offered in a complex mix within some of those things. And I just think if we talk about the age group and the services to them, it gives everybody a sense that we're dealing with a unified group of children, which goes from 0 to 5, when the education department hopefully turns up and takes them on. You know, exactly. I just think that way we've got something which doesn't recognises its health, welfare, learning, social relationships. It's the whole kit and caboodle, and it's very much an intrinsic part of creating a good society.
Absolutely. Doreen, did you just want to remark from the perspective of educators about this ambition of creating a sort of coherent sort of identity for educators?
I think we forget sometimes that the 100,000+ educators in Australia have access to around 1.2 million children, about 800,000 to 900,000 families. So we have a conduit directly to families, and if we get educator buy-in into this campaign, we will have a strong, sustainable, lasting campaign, because families will start to see the educators as their conduit of knowledge. What worries me is that we often provide information to educators about, you know, what's good for early childhood services in the future, and great information. But it fails to get through the hierarchies that exist in services, and it fails to engage educators, because we've missed a step in the development of almost every campaign that's happened in the last 10 years. And that is work closely with educators, building on their growing professional identity around the discussion around wages and qualifications. And if we build on that growing professional identity and use the idea of engagement with their campaign and engagement with the growth of their own sector, early childhood sector, we will have this incredible voice. And the identity of the educator is key to getting them to engage into this or any campaign in the future. Somebody raised with me at a sector meeting yesterday of a few services that we do ourselves a disservice sometimes when we invite somewhat jaded politicians for a photo op into a service, and we give them an opportunity for a photo op which goes into their electorate newsletter and pops out on social media. And we don't deeply engage with the local politician, with the broader base of politicians. So that's a second place where educators can be really active. But all of that takes skill. All of that takes knowledge about how to run a campaign. But it also takes something that we've forgotten about, or we often forget about, that is my stay awake at night. And that is, we forget that learning how to campaign is a skill. I mean, on this screen, I can see some campaigners that with extraordinary campaign histories. And we've learned, it took skill. We learned how to campaign. And sometimes I think we fail to educate educators on how to campaign, and that it's okay to have buy-in into a campaign as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Doreen. I think that's a really powerful observation. It's worth just reminding ourselves about the last sort of successful big social policy reform was in the disability sector.
Yeah.
And one of the really effective tactics that they used was to have morning teas with families of people with disabilities and people with disabilities themselves and local MPs, where every one of them got to see the real life stories of what their lives were like. And going to Eva's point earlier, the way they defined the question was not unmet need, which would have just led to them writing another check. They defined it as dignity and loss of control of their lives, which meant you need a systemic response. And that sort of tells you that whole question of problem definition is such a crucial issue. Now, I might just go to one of the questions that's popped up. Donna Bennett, I think, has asked a question about disability. Donna, did you want to direct your question to the panelists?
Oh, hi everyone. No, I was just when Correna was speaking about vulnerable and disadvantaged families. You mentioned Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander families, and also, you know, financially vulnerable families, other financially vulnerable families called families. And it was more a comment than a question that families that have children with disability and developmental delay also fall into that category of that. So that equity sort of group of families that we that are very vulnerable as well. And there's massive barriers to their inclusion in either childcare centres or preschools across the country. Well, in New South Wales.
Do you want me to respond, Jay?
Yeah.
Yeah, look, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I think the whole issue of inclusion is not just one that's relevant for, you know, birth to 5, but it's also relevant for that, you know, what happens for children who have disability when they get to school. And, you know, I'm really pleased to see that there's such a strong national dialogue happening about this at the moment, but I don't think systemically we've got the answers to this, and that there are still significant barriers for children who have a disability in terms of, you know, inclusion, in terms of being able to participate equally with children who don't have a disability across all settings. And so for me, that connection for funding is just so critically important. The feedback that we get from many of our members is that, in fact, what is a significant barrier is not actually having the resources in place to enable those children who have a disability, who are identified with a disability, to participate. And so, you know, securing ongoing funding, securing funding that actually reflects their disadvantage is so important for children who have many needs.
Thanks, Correna. Now we have another question from Deb Kavanagh on the question of ECEC and where it should sit in government in terms of the relevant agency. Deb, could you ask your question and maybe just also tell us which state you're coming from, because I think that might be a clue to answering the question.
Hi, thanks for the opportunity. I'm in Western Australia and have been part of the education system for many years. And really, I'm just concerned that the voice of our children becomes, I guess, a bit blurred when we talk about combining or putting it back into the education system at all, because for me, I look at it and think, is that a very narrow view? It's a safe view, and it's a department or, you know, system that already exists, so it's quite easy to slip it in there. But I just am concerned that little children, there are the family perspective, the community perspective, and the combination of health departments needs to be considered. And I also am very mindful and a bit worried about the fact that I fear the word school ready, because that's, for me, that's not what our children should be being made. Our children should be being developed at the developmental level that they're at, and the practice and the conversation that all of our early childhood educators need to be able to have is around the fact that we're not making children school ready, but we are giving them opportunities to become, you know, have developmentally appropriate practice. That's just my concern. Thank you for the opportunity. Thanks,
Deb. Yeah, that's a great question. It's something we've really, I certainly in South Australia, when I was Minister for Early Childhood Development, tried to grapple with. In fact, we tried to create a separate agency for early childhood development, which throws up other challenges, I can tell you from experience. Yeah, so because really what we're talking about here is not it's not education, it's not health, it's not child protection, it's not community and family services. It's all of those things, but it's and you really don't want any one agency to get the upper hand. But one of the things is you do have to have an accountable agency. I can tell you the practical politics of sitting around the cabinet table is, if this is early childhood is a small part of everybody's responsibility, which means that it's no one's responsibility. So schools are if it's in the education department, it's dominated by schools. If it's in the health department, it's dominated by public hospitals. If it's in the child protection agency or communities department, it's dominated by adolescent challenges. So this is one of the things. What is the mechanism? But if it's in a very small agency, it's given to the most junior minister with an insufficient budget. So there's a real tension about these things. So this is a real conundrum you've given us, Deb, which we're going to have to think through. I'm conscious that, so did you want to have a chat about that, Sam?
I did. I'm dying to weigh in on that one, because I think this is really fascinating. A couple of years ago, I was at a symposium where it was proposed that the federal government needs a minister for children. And I thought, that's going to be a junior ministry on the outside of nowhere with no kind of budget. I think that would be a disaster. I think this is one of the key complexities and challenges of the campaign that we need to sit with a little bit here. We've got a lot of people involved in early childhood development. We've got infant health nurses, we've got early intervention specialists, we've got early childhood educators and teachers and family services and others. We need to respect those professions, and we need to continue to have those professions connected to the broader professional system that they're part of. And so for early childhood educators and teachers, it is an important part of their professional identity that they are part of the education system. That doesn't mean they don't work in a very, professional way with health and allied health and other professional groups who are involved in early childhood development. And I think we need to get a grip on this, because I worry when people outside the early childhood education system want to rebrand, rename, or make generic the role of people working with young children. I don't think that's in anyone's interests. I think what we need to do is stand up for the fact that people are professionals in their role and they are connected to a broader professional system. And it doesn't mean that we don't want a priority on young children in the early years. We do want a priority on the early years across professions. But the best quality improvement we've got happening in early childhood education is the qualification requirements on early childhood educators, and that's lifting their wages, it's lifting their professionalism, and it makes them much better placed to identify children who are developmentally behind or who need additional support and bring in allied health services that can help them. We don't want to back away from that and make it all sort of a generic early childhood sector.
Excellent.
Well,
look now, so I'm sorry, we've only got a couple of minutes
2 seconds?
left. Yeah.
I think the bigger worry is not the department, it is the departmental senior structure and staff and who they interact with and how they learn to interact. Yeah. That's something that no one's targeting at the moment and really needs to be closely identified. We need to target those senior people.
We'd love to hear more about that, Deb, if you could drop us a bit of a line. Sorry, Eva, we've just got 1 minute to go, and but what I do want to do in the moments we have left is just to really invite you to supply some of any information that you want us to convey when we're off to Canberra to talk to people there. We really would invite you to send that through to us. Of course, you can do that through the campaign. You can do that through the link you've been given here on the chat, or you can do it through Australia at Home. Australia at Home is designed to be a meeting place for civil society to equip those who want to make positive change to act together. And so this mechanism is really a powerful way, I think we've discovered in a new way with COVID. So thriveby5.org.au, Australia at Home, or directly communicating with us on the links that you've been given. We'd really love to hear from you. And today's been valuable. We'd really love you to stay engaged with the campaign and give us the raw material that assists us to go to Canberra. This is only the beginning of a campaign. It really has got a long way to go. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to everything that you've offered today. I just want to thank Correna Haythorpe and Sam Page for, after a very busy year, still making themselves available. And thank you all, especially Eva and Doreen, for your contributions as well to make this a fantastic session. So Merry Christmas, everyone. Happy New Year. And I hope you're back after a break to be motivated to really accelerate this campaign in the first quarter of next year. Thank you all.
Thanks, Jay. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Correna.